I think this is the Smith panel. We have a majority of people named with Smith in their name. Anyway, I think what we covered today is a real a change in an evolution in the way we think of heritage, and it certainly has gone from the grand building. And when I first got involved in heritage in the 70s, people would say, well, you know, this country's only about 100 years old. We don't have any heritage. You have to go to Europe. And the Europeans look at Asia. So, I mean, it's an ongoing process, and we've come to a much more ecological sense of what heritage means and a much deeper understanding of how the practical aspects of older places play a role in our current ability to live. And now we're seeing a major transformation. It's not just the tax base and the developers, it's also a real change in the way commerce itself is conducted. There was a recent piece in The Guardian that noted that on average, some 12% of the downtown core businesses in towns and villages throughout England and Wales have closed in the last 5 years. So we are seeing a really massive change, which is going to affect strip malls that are not visually attractive, even though functionally they're very much like our old main streets. But it's also affecting our attractive, heritage-laden main streets. So this is the context we're operating in now, and I wonder how this affects what each of you have been looking at and writing and talking about. And then from there, any questions you have of each other while you're commenting would be more than welcome. So maybe we just go down the line. Why don't I start with Kathy first? We'll go in the order in which you spoke. There's a microphone there for you to just grab.
As we speak, and I mentioned this on the radio yesterday, Dave LeBlanc and Dave and Chantal LeBlanc are out there on the Danforth. They bought themselves a little building. They're reopening Ethel, and they've been posting twice a day about sourcing tile and finding this and who's got this and how can we and so that they're in the process of creating this amazing little place that is going to be a great addition to the city. So I mean, while when you watch main streets over time, they ebb and flow, and so that this change in retail, I think some of the factors people are blaming is online retail, and maybe for stuff that we already know exactly what we want, that's the best way to get it. But it'll be when there's vacancies and the rates go down, then Chantal and Dave LeBlanc move in and do something interesting. And so I think that the point of this fabric is it's resilient and it can adapt to change over time. So what we have to do, the challenge is to conserve that so that we can continue to have all these interesting things happening in the city. In terms of questions, one of the things in the streetcar suburbs idea, when I was in Minneapolis, I was trying to find a cup of coffee, and I was trying to find that little shop they took their streetcars off. All the Main Street buildings went with them. So that relationship is just like so critical.
I guess I'll agree that there are cycles. So if you look at the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, it was architects and planners who led this idea that what you referred to, that tenement houses are immoral, and even in the Plateau District in Montreal, triplexes. Somerville in Boston, triplexes were outlawed because they were immoral to have several families living above each other. Who knows what could go on. So the single family home became the utopian ideal. You had to have your own place, and it was for moral reasons. I look at condos as the new tenement houses, and the fact that now single family homes are immoral and you have to live in tenement houses. And it's strange how we keep grasping onto what the utopian future will be. When Jennifer Keesmaat was chief planner and said we're going to have 130 new heritage conservation districts and we're going to also have this utopian sustainable city of 5-6-story buildings, I thought that's two utopias that are not working together. That's not a future for a city. So I think the cycles changed. Live-work has become a pattern. Well, live-work is what created these main streets. The live-work nature of today is different, but we had a small architectural practice. We bought an old general store. We made the ground floor into a combination retail, community, and our boardroom space. And we had the offices above. You can fit new patterns into old buildings. That's what Jane Jacobs said. And I think the patterns are changing. And I also had another analogy. Someone said high-tech workers are the new mill workers of the 19th century. They think they're in this big industry and they're all going to be the multimillionaires, but most of them are working long hours for poor pay. That's, you know, these trends just reoccur, and I agree. I think there's a resilience that we have to respect. And you also have to, when you do community studies, not talk to the property owners, but the renters as well. And density, this whole argument of single-family housing, we think we went to low density. The highest density neighborhood in Canada is West Vancouver, which is high-rise. The second highest density is the Plateau District, which is those old 3- and 4-story walk-ups, which is a low-rise, high-density area. There are areas of Old Toronto which are low-rise, which are amazingly high density, and we have to get away from high-rise equals high density. That's just a fallacy.
The concerns about the viability of the retail sector in the age of Amazon, I mean, are real, but I always try to think of these things historically. So we all remember what the Eaton Centre was going to do to Yonge Street, and so Yonge Street was resilient enough, and it came back eventually. There were similar concerns about Walmart about a generation ago. I wrote stories about this. And what would Walmart do to older downtowns? And in some cases, it crushed those older downtowns. And in other cases, independent retail was, sort of came back. So, I don't profess to be able to predict the future, but I think that I think what retail has going for it is a very basic connection to the human condition, which is that we are social animals and that we need to be together in places that are quite varied. So those are workspaces. I'm self-employed. I write in coffee shops with lots of other people who are self-employed writing in coffee shops. So those are new workspaces and they're retail spaces. So, I think that there's an adaptability, and the base condition is density, right? If there's enough density, then you get those kind of economies of scale.
I think one of the things that is a question for us from heritage conservation perspective is finding the right mix of, or perhaps avoiding, if one would say, as Julian is saying, the utopian perspective. And it's a really fine balance, I think, of truly understanding what is heritage conservation. And one of the things that troubles me the most is a concern that from shopkeepers and BIAs and a variety is that of property owners is that somehow our heritage protection or listing is going to kill their business. And I would challenge the ACO and others of explaining that that isn't the intent in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, I would say we're trying to, if anything, collaborate because we want to recognize that it's a unique place. We have this phrase of placemaking as being so important to us. Doesn't have to be heritage, and it doesn't have to be, planning policies. But I think there is a disconnect right now of place. A lot of people that are moving into neighborhoods. This is the example of, I'm thinking of Mount Pleasant Village in particular. Don't see the residents coming out to our evening meetings. They're young families, they're working. Try to get them when we went out had our booth out in the fall fair or spring events, there's street sales, et cetera. But I think that, young people in my office, they order Uber Eats. They're not going They're at least keeping the businesses alive, but they're not out there every day using the street because and I think that, it's great that there's the independent workforce and people, but I think one of the things, this whole movement of shop local or participate within your community is a larger social thing that's not just about online shopping.
Do any others of you have questions of each other or anything you want to fill out the, Kath?
I had a question for Julian. I mean, I just wanted to say that the way that the approach to the byward market, I just think was absolutely brilliant and so ahead of its time. But I almost don't want to ask this question, but you did refer to a thought that you think that we couldn't do something the same now as a means of preserving. And without getting too into the weeds of the heritage regulations, could you comment on that?
Yeah, that's a tough question because people know my feelings about the current legislative framework. So I don't have an easy answer. We just dealt with a community that has designated itself as a cultural heritage landscape. They didn't want to be a heritage conservation district. They certainly didn't want the current planning act to be dictating the future of this community, and it has yet to play out. So I think that's where I'm always looking for, how do you give power back to the community to start making its own decisions? And I think so much is changing. The systems by which we regulate ourselves, the idea of boxes of disciplines that don't talk to each other. And so I see us in a time of transition, and I say to my students at LeBlanc, you're part of figuring this out. So I don't think in the current legislative framework it is easy at all. When we were doing the byward market, designation didn't mean demolition control. It just meant if you did want to demolish, there was a 90-day period. Mm-hmm. I think like New Brunswick, we should go back to that, and in that 90-day period, you get an independent market assessment. Anyone else who wants to buy the building for that price can buy it in its current state. Irving got caught in that. They had an industrial building in St. John, New Brunswick. Irving has never sold a property in their life. They just gobble things up. They were forced to put on the market. A young guy bought this old industrial building, created a wonderful commercial space out of it. Irving has figured out, all right, this really means something pretty interesting, that you're not forcing anybody to do anything. They don't have to keep a heritage building. But you have a 90-day period when anybody can come in and say, I have an idea for that, or the municipality can buy the building and then sell it to an interested owner. So I think we have to look around, and I would say look to the West Coast. The West Coast cities have integrated planning, heritage, and environmental issues in a way that don't look at Boston, Philadelphia, New York. They have nothing to teach us. It's Portland. I mean, all these cities that are so livable that they're now too expensive. But take that model and broaden it.
Well, you just raised a rather critical issue, which is the high property values that we're looking at now. So that the Jane Jacobs mantra about old buildings being cheaper and therefore creating new spaces, we're having a really hard time with that. We're losing artists from Toronto who used to find space quite readily, and much retail is in that position as well. As I mentioned to John earlier, you're seeing that with the strip malls, the suburban strip malls. Now those properties are just being torn down wholesale to create condos that may or may not have any commercial function in them at all. They were designed for cars, and we're trying to get people out of cars, but they're not they're not helping with either new transportation or old transportation, and they're not good for pedestrians either. And that has to do with property value. And I guess some other people will be getting later in the day into some of those concerns, but it really does stick a bit of a knife in some of the great ideas that people have for preservation and reuse.
So 6 months ago, Vancouver rezoned every single family home in Vancouver into a duplex. Mm-hmm. I think that was pretty clever. I'd love to see Toronto do similar things where you just say, we're going to achieve density in our existing built fabric in order to make real estate more affordable, apartments more affordable.
Mm. Anyone else?
I might just follow up on how I started my conversation of where are the main streets. I think I recall, and this is maybe just to follow up a little bit about the work that some of the other places that I've helped and advised on. The historic downtown of Hamilton is going through quite a bit of rejuvenation. I'd encourage anyone to go out and have a day trip out to Hamilton. I think Toronto is such a large city that we have to think in new terms beyond just applying some of our conservation ideas of how we've dealt with main streets. And the one saving grace on the opposite side is really understanding that it's communities rather than a metropolitan solution, which is, I think, one of the things that Toronto, generally speaking, I'm just saying personally, struggles with is we're a big place now. Not all solutions work across this city. And that, I think, has been something we continue to struggle about, is from amalgamation of, as a huge municipal government. And so I think I'm interested in your comment about Vancouver and some solutions, but I just see the incredible things that are in front of us, be it transportation or mobility, housing, et cetera, that these are big pieces that need to be helping us to move forward on main streets. It's not an excuse, but I think a recognition. How do we go next and grow as a city is a big question, and people like Richard Florida and others have their perspective on it, but we get gobbled up in that.
I just want to add this, that I'm always a little bit skeptical about the aesthetic argument with respect to this topic. Like much of what we've discussed this morning is a notion of the main street as it exists south of Eglinton, and we're going to be talking in the afternoon about strip malls, and I've written about strip malls, and they're not beautiful. And then you have like sort of the evolution of that in parts of Agincourt, where you have these sort of commercial buildings that are 2 and 3 stories high, and there's like shops and strange things on the upper floors, and it's very granular and interesting, but not really good looking. And in my experience, one of the worst, the least successful attempts is when planners or developers have tried to sort of drop in something that's Main Street-like in the the context of an older part of the city into that environment, right? So pushing a building. I could think of one on Marley, for example, where you're pushing a building up against the sidewalk. You say, okay, well, we've done that. We've ticked that box off, but it actually is not helping things at all. So to your point about what cultural landscapes are, that the cultural landscape is a social phenomenon, and especially with retail, it's social and it's highly fluid. It's like a fast-moving river, and it's totally important to sort of make sure that it's not obliterated in those parts of the city where we have that great grain, but we're also recognizing that it's just different in newer parts which were built around the car.
I just want to be, we have to wrap in a minute, but I wanted to put a couple of things on the table. I had said I had some ideas about how we, some of the things we need to change and it's all about tools we could put into the world that would conserve that fine grain ownership pattern. I mean, a couple of things I wanted to target. Right now, if you buy 2 properties next to each other, they automatically are joined into one property. You don't have to do a thing, it just happens. But if you want to take that same property and subdivide it into 2 small lots, you have to go through committee of adjustment. I think that's ass backwards. I mean, what we should be preserving is the ability to keep these things small, and you need special permission. Like, what's your reason for wanting to consolidate 10 lots into, what are we going to get for that process? So I think that would be a pretty quick bit of law to fix. And there's some other, these are all geared to trying to conserve the fine grain fabric. The other thing I think was very successful in Ottawa was this notion of, the 50-year-old lot, and you can control, I've asked lawyers about how, can we have a maximum lot size, and they say no. But you can have a maximum building size, and I think that was one of the geniuses in the Byward market planning. So just some thoughts on, those are some tools. I got another thing, maybe we shouldn't allow condominiums to be built unless each piece of retail in the bottom is sold off in small pieces, and there's condominium ownership of those things, so that there's some chance that over time those things might evolve into interesting places to do business. So those are just little ideas. Anybody else, or do we have to stop? Oh, how long we got?
You still have time.
Okay.
So if you have more ideas.
I have a one that I haven't figured out. Maybe some brighter minds are here, which is the exorbitant fee to cap your active high voltage wires that are within proximity of the elevation of your commercial property on main streets, thinking Parliament, thinking Queen Street. The shop owners have told us it's between 70 and 80,000 to cap it for the time that is needed to do the repairs to those buildings.
Don't get me started on that. Oh my God.
So it's these small but important barriers that I think we need as an ecosystem of tools that are beyond planning and heritage.
So in your retail study that was launched for the city do you know whether they will be collecting information? I know there's a residential and a business.
I didn't do the business one because I'm not a business.
You haven't seen it. Okay,
No.
there is just released quite recently a survey that anybody can participate in online. It's being done by the city to do with retail streets in Toronto. And I took a very quick look at the residential questions, and I must say I stopped because I was so annoyed by the way the survey was set up. But I would hope there's a thing at the end that I didn't get to that lets you add in sections about real complaints like this electrical one, which I would imagine most people who are concerned about heritage don't even think of that unless they happen to own a building that's been affected by that or have a friend who's been affected by that. And there are other things like that that are just, that are interfering with people doing business. If we want people to do business, they have to have a clear path to do so, I would think. So I don't know if the city's looking at that, but they certainly should be looking at that in this study that they're doing.
That survey for residents is how do you use the shops on your
I know, but the way they ask,
yeah.
they ask questions like, where do you buy your sporting goods? Locally or in big box? And then if you don't fill that out, because I don't buy sporting goods, then they tell you have to put one or the other.
Yeah.
One other thing we've recommended in Ottawa is that under the new Heritage Act, you have to do heritage impact statements, which are really dividing the heritage community. And the assumption with a heritage impact statement is that a new development may have a negative impact on the heritage of the district. My view is that no development should be allowed to go ahead that doesn't have a positive impact on the heritage district, so that shouldn't even be on the table. The question should be, how does the existing cultural heritage of your district impact your design? How can you prove that you're responding to the heritage of that area? What is the impact of what exists on what you're doing? Which to me is the argument that a developer or a designer should have to answer. How are we improving? San Francisco, quite a few years ago, essentially removed zoning from the whole city and said, we're going to allow anything, any size, any use, any mixed use, whatever. But we're going to set up an urban design commission. Any project over a certain size, you have to come to that commission and prove that San Francisco will be a better place after you've done your project than before. The developer said, that's crazy. We have to have rules. We have to know what we're doing. And the city said, well, San Francisco is pretty attractive. We're not worried about attracting developers. We've got them. I think Toronto's in that situation. I think they should have people prove to them that the city of Toronto is going to be a better place after the development. And I think communities have to have a voice in that discussion. And if the community says our community is going to be in a worse condition, and I think of that high rise that the OMB allowed in North York where they were going to name the street. I don't know if they did, OMB Folly, but I think there has to be a way that you prove the benefit rather than trying to whitewash the negative aspects.
So it looks like we need a catalog of ass-backwards approaches so that we can get rid of them all.
So I would, just to play devil's advocate a little bit about the maximum retail size, I would be cautious about over-regulating what happens in the base of new street-facing mixed-use buildings, because our retail patterns, our retail habits change, right? So I'm not going to do this, but I would imagine that I can guess what would happen if I asked for a show of hands of who's ordered something on Amazon today. So there are larger format retail shops, Shoppers is a good example, which are, necessities. They're necessities in a neighborhood. People always complain about, too many dentists' offices in the base of condo buildings and so on. But I have a lot of time for that kind of retail being part of the retail mix, because the concern at the other end is that you get too precious and you get too much of the. I hope that's not mine. You get. By over-regulating, you create, you narrow the field of potential tenants, and then you create a situation where you have tenants that have a product or a service that has enough margin to deal with the constraints, and is maybe too specialized, and then you get into this problem. Monocultures like Queen West between University Avenue and Spadina, which is a monoculture of high-end clothing chains and was, is subject to an HCD. So,
I think it's.
Sorry, my phone is sitting back there unattended.
A minor crime.
All right.
Did you want to comment on that, Kathy? Because you have.
Well, that's a complicated question, and yes, Shoppers Drug Mart does have good things to offer, but we don't need one in every damn corner, and we don't need them all over the city, and so I get your point, and I'm not sure what the right answer is here, but at the moment the scales are tipped way too far in favor of Shoppers Drug Mart.
Yeah, and I would say there are plenty of places in the city of Toronto which have 100-foot lots, 200-foot lots that suit Shoppers Drug Mart. So I think the question is not to have only a fine-grained city. Although David Crombie was pretty interesting when he downs-zoned the whole city to 4 stories and then say, and now we'll think about exemptions. That's kind of the San Francisco approach. And so you could say that we like a somewhat fine-grained street because there are some pretty deadly instances where you put in a convention center and you've got basically 2 blocks of blank
space.
wall, and I thought your example of the invasive species of housing for 2 blocks, we just have to protect against that. But I agree. I mean, scale, and there are new parts of the city where people are going to choose to have wide open spaces. There's also this cycle. I think the Tower project is amazing to say maybe on these big, wide open spaces we can introduce a different layer which allows street frontage. I don't know how that's developing, but the city is an amazing ecology, and let's not give it a utopian future. Let's allow an organic development with the community involved, because communities are amazingly diverse.
Anyone else want to add anything? Well, we weren't going to do questions from the floor because the questions are often as long, but we do actually have some time. So if who
We still
has
have
a
10
question?
minutes, so I guess we can.
1, 2. Okay. If somebody could move this microphone around.
All right. Well, I'm going to go over here to the back. Even though. Yeah.
Thank you. I just have a question. It's slightly techie in nature, but it refers to Catherine's comment on the lack of second exits for many of these buildings that don't have a rear laneway. And in order to allow these buildings to stay vital, are there any planning tools in the city toolbox that would allow consolidated right-of-way at the rear of these properties to enable that second exit. Because right now, for example, the picture on the screen, these buildings probably don't have that rear second access.
Let me just say, I think in the 90s we talked about main streets in the 70s, and in that point we were talking about them as historic buildings. In the 90s we really got into what is this about, and that we need to make those 2 stories with 1 exit legal. And there was a lot of work done on it. I think it was kind of like a streetcar development, and I forget the name of the people who were involved in it, but there was an analysis, and they analyzed the safety of them, and that there's not a lot of record of loss of life in these buildings because they're kind of low occupancy, and the second staircase for that exit just takes up way too much floor space. It makes them unworkable as units. So that process went through, it was changes to the Ontario Building Code, not a zoning issue. It's a building code issue. There were changes to the Ontario Building Code that went through first and second reading, and they were almost there, and then the development industry got wind of it, and man, that process was shut down so fast because it was going to create a whole bunch of little investors that were going to compete with the big guys. And so that initiative died on the altar of safety, which a safety that doesn't exist. So I think we need to look at that again, and it'll take another government. Who knows? Maybe this is the government that'll do it because they have maybe they're interested in helping small business and this kind of fabric and small entrepreneurs. I don't know who they stand for, but don't laugh. Who knows? People can surprise you. So. That's the issue that's the building code issue. It's a building code issue. It's Ministry of Housing. It's a very complicated process to do it. But we almost had it, and so if we dusted that off and went after that initiative, that would be one of the things that we could do, so that it would be possible to rebuild these things when they burn down.
We've got another question, or do you want?
Oh, I just was going to follow up. I'm not a planner, so I'm not going to comment from a planning perspective, but I would say that part of our research right now is looking at what is available in the United States to support apartments and housing above retail in small, live above the shops, not only in the United States, in the UK, and certainly our research has shown that in the United States that in their tax rebates, these are the state ones, that they consider introducing small elevators in these buildings as an eligible cost for a heritage tax rebate.
Okay, second question.
Hi, my question was for John Lawrence, and I wanted to know if streetcar suburbs are the same as bus suburbs. Can buses do the same thing that streetcars do? And can you talk also about the difference to a community of building subways, even ideal Parisian-like proportions of subway stations, where you've got lots and lots of subway stations, compared to streetcars and buses?
Kathy just said that's a big question. It's a big question. I don't think that bus suburbs have the same kind of gravitational pull, because by definition, the routes can change. I mean, we had a lot of trolleys in Toronto in the early 20th century and right up into the 1970s, and I think that they were more permanent. But I think it's the permanence of the infrastructure which is important. With respect to your question about subways, I think much depends on the distance between subway stops. And so I know the streetcar versus subway debate, and I'm a little bit skeptical about that it's always going to be streetcars that produce a better urban form and a better retail form. But for sure, when you build like stops that are, 2 or 3 or 4 kilometers apart, then you get none of that walkability. Like you get the circle around the streetcar stop or the subway stop plus a parking lot.